Bill Powell and Haynie Gourley had been partners and very successful in the creation and operation of the Capital Chevrolet Company on Murfreesboro Pike.
Bill Powell was accused of killing his partner, Gourley, in the Capital Chevrolet. The officers were out on Murfreesboro Road over a dispute as to who would be the dealer or who would be the partner in Capital Chevrolet.
In my opinion, I think that what Mr. Powell did is he reached around like this, and he and Haynie Gourley are going down the road, and I think he fired that shot, and anticipating that this will go right through the seat and kill him right here, or go right through the spine, and it didn't.
Mr. Wolf, I don't know what's going on. I saw Mr. Powell drive in. He said it's not good, son. He said he said it looks like Mr. Gourley's been shot.
And the jury would go out to supper, and the jury would be introduced to John Hooker Sr. on a full belly, and I knew that wasn't good.
I'll never forget it. He said, "Son, don't take this personal. This is not personal. The jury, his peers have spoken, and that's what we live by."
Can I have your attention for just a moment, please? Certainly want to welcome all of you who are able to get down here this afternoon for this very interesting and special program. But before we begin the actual program, I wanted to take this opportunity to thank some folks that have been very generous and kind to us now for 10 years in putting on these historical CLEs. The first and foremost is the United States District Court for the Middle District of Tennessee. Back in the beginning, when we were working with Judge Campbell, they were very helpful in getting us the technological assistance that we needed. No lawyers are paid for this. This is all volunteer work. But over the years, they've continued to underwrite it, so I wanted to especially thank Chief Judge Crenshaw and the U.S. District Court for their funding of the technical part of the program, which you'll see in a moment. I also want to thank the Historical Committee of the Bar Association itself, which originated the shows back in 2012 based on the 50th anniversary of the Baker versus Carr case. And then, as they say, things just kind of evolved after that, and now here we are for number 7. And last but certainly not least, and I think you'll agree with me on this, the Nashville Downtown Public Library has donated the space, the facilities, and their technology for all of these programs. And I would ask that we give them a nice round of applause just right here at the beginning.
Bill Powell and Haynie Gourley had been partners and very successful in the creation and operation of the Capital Chevrolet Company on Murfreesboro Pike. They were both extremely well known in Nashville and the community, both from a business standpoint and socially. They were considered to be eminently successful in the automobile business and in the business world of Nashville. They came to a parting of the ways. They had some big division of opinion over the business. The story is that one morning, Bill Powell and Haynie Gourley got in an automobile and were just taking a ride to discuss their differences. Well, a little while later, Bill Powell come driving back into Chevrolet Motor Company with Gourley on the seat, shot dead, and Powell shot in the leg. Powell hollering and crying and insisting that they get an ambulance right away, saying that somewhere on the trip some unknown person had got in the back of the car as they were turning around and shot Gourley and shot him. and then disappeared, got out of the car and disappeared. Well, he was charged with murder after investigation.
What you just heard was the voice of Jack Norman Sr., legendary Nashville lawyer, who was one of the key players in the trial that you're going to hear about today. We want to thank David Tune and his mother Carolyn for allowing us to use these audio tapes that David made of his grandfather some years ago, and they allow us to hear in first person some of the inside information about this great trial. Jack Norman himself was born on July 20th, 1904, on 2nd Avenue South, just 12 blocks from the Davidson County Courthouse, where he would make his living for some 60 years, and most would agree would be one of the most dynamic characters in that building for the second part of the middle part of the 20th century. But also occurring during that same summer in 1904 was the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, better known to many as the World's Fair in St. Louis in 1904. Probably at almost the same time that Jack Norman was being born in Nashville, a family of 2 parents and 5 children in Cross Plains, Tennessee, were preparing to go on a trip to the St. Louis World's Fair. They got on the train, they went to St. Louis, they were there for almost 2 weeks. They rode Ferris wheels and watched some of the entertainment in the great fair. And then as they returned to Union Station in St. Louis, the father of these 5 children announced that he would be staying in St. Louis for a few days, but he was sending the mother and the 5 back to Cross Plains. So they got on the train, and he remained at the station. As the Pullman car pulled out, the mother put the children, ages 1 through 8, to bed one at a time. After all of them were asleep, she left the Pullman car, went to the rear of the train, and got off at the next stop. And neither father nor mother were ever seen again. The oldest of these 5 children, 8 years old, was William Haynie Gourley. Haynie Gourley, as he preferred to be known, and his 4 brothers and sisters were met at the station by a cousin who expected to see the entire family, but on seeing no one, went on the train and found the children crying in the Pullman car, I suppose, and had discovered what had happened, and they actually had to take the train back to Springfield for them to get off. And then he began the process of farming them out to families in the community because they had all become orphans. Haynie went to school through the 4th grade and then decided that he needed to make enough money to support himself and his family, so he left school and began working in the fields of Robertson County. And at age 19, he decided that he needed to improve himself further, and he came to Nashville and found a job in a tailor shop on 4th Avenue. Not long after that, 1915, World War I broke out, and Haynie Gourley went to the war and fought for the United States in France and in other places, and came back, fortunately, unharmed. And when he came back, he decided to use his rather considerable sales ability, not in the selling of clothes, but in the area of automotive sales. He got a job as a used car salesman, and of course you can probably imagine the story that comes next. Little by little, through hard work, determination, street smarts that was picked up from being left alone for all those years, Haynie Gourley became a very successful businessman and eventually was able to buy a dealership on Broadway, and you'll hear more details about all of that later from Judge Cantrell. Now, I mentioned that Haynie Gourley was successful in his work. He was also successful in that he managed to hire some of the best people in the automobile business in Nashville to come work for him. And today's program is going to focus partly on his life, which was really quite interesting and amazing, but also, unfortunately, on his death. Because, as you know from reading the newspapers and seeing what's in the hall, that's what this case is about. Now, we are sensitive to the fact that while lawyers may say the jury has spoken, there remains with the Gourley family a profound grief and a nagging feeling that justice may not have been done. Multiple presenters today will dissect the case and the trial and look for reasons why the outcome was so controversial. We will attempt to explore the significance of changes in the law as well as forensic evidence that may or may not have been available, but for some reason or another was not presented, and of course the contrast between the methods that they had in 1968 and what we have today. If the case had happened today, I think many of us would speculate that a very different result might have occurred. On the surface, the facts are simple. Two business partners go out for a drive and both get shot. But the driver, who is not seriously wounded, is the one who would benefit most from the untimely death of the other. And that man is now deceased. The surviving man says under oath that an unknown robber got in the car and did the shooting. That person, if he existed, was never identified or apprehended. In order for the family of the dead man to inherit the business, a highly profitable automobile dealership, the surviving partner must be convicted of murder. Hence, the trial. In the past, I've mentioned the fact that we get lucky on these programs. I call it divine intervention, but luck is the usual word that people use. But we got lucky again. My son, Charles Yarbrough, Assistant District Attorney, seated right down here, located a fellow named Sonny Collier, who at age 19 was working a summer job at Capital Chevrolet on Murfreesboro Road on May 24, 1968. And I want you to listen now to what Sonny saw and heard that day.
I was in the golf business of being a golfer at the dealership. I would bring the customers' cars in from the lot when they were finished in the shop to the service lane where the customers would pick the cars up. I ran a variety of errands when told to, or pick up or deliver a car, and that's just a variety of running around doing the work for the parts department or the service advisors, getting the cars and things. And it was a short while that day. I hadn't been there but a few weeks after school, and I was, as I recall, I was taking a message on that day from the parts department from Mr. Walker, the parts manager, or his secretary perhaps, down to the office, which had me coming from the hill down the hill into the service department, into the service lane there with this. And when the lane was not full of cars that day, it was around midday, 11 o'clock or so, I think. And as I was coming through the door to cross the service lane to do what I was told to do, a full-size Chevrolet sedan, I noticed that, I believe it was a Caprice, came down the hill around the curve, and I couldn't help but notice that they were not driving erratically, but they hurriedly arrived into the service lane. And I did see that the driver I knew as Mr. Bill Powell, the one of the owners of the company, and there was another person in the car, appeared to be a male in the car, slumped over in the seat, now like this, and I said, well, this I remember thinking something like, well, something's happened here. What, I didn't know what was going on. Mr. Powell was opening the door, and Mr. Meadows ran over to the door to him, and then things started really moving fast. And Mr. Powell were getting out of the car, and he, of course, had his voice raised in alarm. I was thinking, probably don't have any business here in my position.
None of his business. Now, let's do a quick poll. How many of you have been to the Rigor Mortis brew pub in Scotland? The rest of the T-shirt says, "Come by for a stiff one." That's not in the script, Jody. You don't need to look for a slide on that one. So almost immediately, some investigators were suspicious. One of them sitting right in front of me here. And they were questioning the story that Bill Powell was telling that day about a black man jumping in the back seat and shooting the two of them. One of their questions was, why was the smaller and older man virtually executed and the large man only shot in the leg? Why was there no dust on the black carpet in the back seat of the car? What are the odds that Mr. Gourley is randomly shot one day before Mr. Powell was about to lose his ownership interest in Capital Chevrolet, but as a result of the shooting becomes sole owner? Now, we have another celebrity in the room, and that's Mr. Hal Harden, who is more commonly known to our team as the third man at the counsel table. We couldn't find a single word uttered by Mr. Harden on the transcript of the case, because he'd only been a member of the bar for about 2 or 3 months at the time of this. But he's a terrific source for us, and I want you to listen to what he had to say about some of those questions that occurred to him when he went to General Hospital.
I formed an opinion early on about what I thought happened because being a part-time investigator for the DA's office, it just so happened that we got the call, me and George Curry, another investigator for the DA's office, we got the call to come to General Hospital that there had been a shooting. And both of us arrived out there, and this is the first time I'd ever seen a corpse of somebody that had been shot. Haynie Gourley was on a slab, and had his shirt off. And I remember he was so pale white, and his stomach he was kind of a big man. But I saw the bullet holes, and I can't tell you exactly where they were right now, and I haven't gone back to check. But I saw the bullet holes, and I'd never seen a bullet hole in somebody, but it makes a bruise, or it did around him. He had purple around where the bullets went in. And we were talking, well, what happened here? And the police officer that was out there saying, well, supposedly some Negro jumped in the back seat and shot him. And also there was a bullet that when they laid him out here, Mr. Gourley, on a slab, and the bullet fell out. There was a bullet that had gone in the back seat and come through. Somebody had shot from the back seat and hit a piece of steel in the seat, and it reflected off. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was very suspicious. And also I remember things that I thought were suspicious. I said, to me, it didn't make any sense, and I was no expert on it. It just didn't seem like it was logical to me. And there were other things about where the glass was found on the side of the road, and it was a dusty road out there. There was construction, but there was nothing in the back seat. On the floorboard, there was no dust. There was no footprints. It was just very clean in the back seat of the car. I remember the rearview mirror had been pushed down, And I thought about how Powell had said that he was shot, and he was a big guy and very athletic. I think he was All-American at Vanderbilt. And it was on his left leg, and it just kind of grazed this part of his pants leg here. And I just thought the entire thing was suspicious, but I certainly was not a homicide investigator, and I was no expert. But
our third eyewitness, who was present that day, was actually working his second job at the Third National Bank building, which had just been opened, brand new building at the corner of 4th and Church downtown. But police detective, homicide detective Sherman Nickens was working his other job at that location when he got a call from the district attorney's office letting him know that he would be the chief investigator in what was now widely known as the Capital Chevrolet murder case. I want you to hear what Detective Nickens says about that day.
Well, I had to work an extra job, and so I was working at 4th and Church, building a new Third National Bank building right there. And Charlie Hunter, with the Attorney General's offices, came by there and said that General Shriver wanted me to come out to Vanderbilt Hospital. So, but I went out there, and there was General Shriver, Charlie Hunter, Attorney General, and myself, and there was a guy. I'd heard of him and knew him, but I didn't really know him, named Bill Powell, sitting in there in one of the rooms. Well, General Shriver told me that he had been shot in a holdup. Him and another guy named Haynie Gourley had owned a Capital Chevrolet. And General Shriver wanted me to investigate it. And you know, I was a homicide investigator, but I had an extra job. And so what do you do when the powers to be tell you they want you to investigate? So that's how I become to it. General Shriver said, I want that man, if I'm going to investigate it, I want that man, Bill Powell. I want his hands in bags. I don't want him to change clothes. I don't want him to do nothing. We done that and went out to Capital Chevrolet on Murfreesboro Road, and there was a car sitting there, and that's how the investigation started. A policeman was there, also a major or lieutenant, I can't remember. He was there around it, but people were milling around it, and you don't dare touch nothing that's involved in a scene. And that was a scene right there for me. They hadn't done nothing to it. It was sitting there, but, oh yeah, had people been touching it? Of course they had. Okay. Well, fingerprints, blood splatters, because we had one dead man and one other than shot. And to want to know about all the blood serology and all that, I went and put on a suit and tie, and I become an investigator. Went back to the hospital. They'd take the hands off of Bill Powell, the wrappers. They cleaned him up. He had on hospital clothes. They'd killed that scene. They destroyed it. They scrubbed his hands and everything else. And down here, I wanted to see if I had any residue, paraffin around there, where he had, what the distance was he'd been shot from. Powell's clothes, he done had carried to the laundry room in Charlotte. He didn't do a lot of talking to me, but Cecil Branstetter was his lawyer. Okay, Cecil wouldn't let me talk to him. I mean, he shut that down quick.
That's our first example of good lawyering by Mr. Branstetter. Many ironies in these cases as we study them more carefully. One of them is that the day after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, and that headline was present, we see that the Third National Bank building actually opened up. And now to bring you a lot more, a very interesting lot more, I think, about the year 1968 is, I believe, the first time that a sitting president of the Nashville Bar Association has been in one of our programs. Martisa Johnson Moore will tell you about 1968 in America.
The Smithsonian Magazine dubbed 1968 as the year that shattered America. Considered one of the most turbulent years of the 20th century, war, assassinations, racism, riots, political upheaval, 1968 was filled with it all. It was a time of resistance, rebellion, and deep reflection in the US, and an important backdrop that framed the Powell case. 1968 became a year of triumphs and tragedies, social and political upheavals that forever changed our country. Thanks to the Smithsonian, History Channel, and the Tennessean, here are some of the key events of 1968. January 20th, game of the century. Top-ranked UCLA, led by future basketball legend Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, faces second-ranked University of Houston, led by Elvin Hayes at the Astrodome. Houston snaps UCLA's 47-game winning streak, 71-69, in the first NCAA basketball game to be nationally televised in primetime. This was the granddaddy to March Madness. January 23rd, North Korea seizes the USS Pueblo, claiming the surveillance ship strayed into its waters. One US crewman is killed and 82 others are imprisoned. An 11-month standoff with the United States follows. On February 1st, Memphis sanitation workers, Echo Cole and Robert Walker, are crushed to death by a malfunctioning garbage truck. Their deaths led to a strike that became a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement. February 7th, after a battle for the Vietnamese village of Binh Tre, an American officer tells Associated Press reporter Peter Arnett it became necessary to destroy the town in order to save it. The quotation, printed in newspapers nationwide, becomes a catchphrase for opponents of the Vietnam War. February 27th, Walter Cronkite, in a CBS TV special on his recent tour of Vietnam, says the U.S. war effort is mired in stalemate and amplifies public skepticism of the war. February 29th, the report of the Kerner Commission, appointed by President Lyndon B. Johnson to examine the causes of race riots in American cities in previous years, declares the nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. March 12th, Nixon wins 78% of the vote in New Hampshire's GOP primary. Eugene McCarthy, Minnesota's anti-war senator, takes a shocking 42% of the Democratic vote. On March 13th, Atlantic Richfield and Humble Oil, now ExxonMobil, announced the discovery of an oil field beneath Prudhoe Bay, Alaska, the largest oil and natural gas discovery in North American history. On March 16th, New York Senator Robert F. Kennedy enters the race for the Democratic presidential nomination, saying McCarthy's showing in New Hampshire has proven how deep are the present divisions within our party and country. It is now unmistakably clear that we can change these disastrous, divisive policies only by changing the men who make them. March 19th, hundreds of students take over the administration building at Howard University in Washington, D.C., seeking a greater voice in student discipline and the curriculum. March 31st, as war pressures mount, President Lyndon B. Johnson, who in 1964 won 61% of the popular vote to Barry Goldwater's 39, announces he is not running for re-election. On April the 3rd, some 1,000 men returned their draft cards to government offices all over the country. And on April 4th, Martin Luther King Jr., in Memphis for the sanitation workers' strike, is fatally shot on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. Gunman James Earl Ray flees the country. The impact of Dr. King's life and work was immediately evident. Over the next week, riots in more than 100 cities nationwide leave 39 people dead, more than 2,600 people injured, and 21,000 people arrested. On April 11th, Johnson signs the Fair Housing Act, banning discrimination in housing on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin. It is the last of the landmark civil rights laws he signed. April 29th, Hair opens on Broadway and runs for more than 1,700 performances, introducing mainstream theater goers to sex, drugs, rock and roll, and draft resistance. On May 10th, the United States and North Vietnam began peace talks in Paris. On May 27th, the Supreme Court rules 7-1 that burning a draft card is not an act of free speech protected by the First Amendment. On June the 4th, Robert F. Kennedy, gaining momentum in his presidential campaign, wins the California primary and is assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. The gunman, a Jordanian citizen of Palestinian descent, is captured at the scene. Now 73, he is serving life in prison. On June 8th, James Earl Ray is arrested in London. Extradited to the United States, he pleads guilty to murdering Dr. King, but later recants, saying he was unwitting pawn in a conspiracy. He dies in a Nashville prison of liver failure in 1998 at the age of 70. On June 19th, the efforts of the Poor People's Campaign climaxes in the Solidarity Day rally for jobs, peace, and freedom in Washington, D.C. 50,000 people joined the 3,000 participants living at Resurrection City on the National Mall to rally around the demands for economic justice for poor people in the Poor People's Campaign on Solidarity Day. On July the 1st, Johnson signs the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which remains the world's primary means of preventing the spread of nuclear weapons to non-nuclear states and reducing nuclear weapons in the world. On July 20th, the first Special Olympics opens at Chicago's Soldier Field, with more than 1,000 athletes with intellectual disabilities competing in 200 events. August 5th through the 8th, the Republican National Convention formally nominates Nixon for president. August 21st, Private First Class James Anderson Jr., who died covering an enemy grenade to protect fellow Marines during a firefight in Vietnam, becomes the first African-American Marine to receive the Medal of Honor. On September 9th, Arthur Ashe wins the US Open, becoming the first Black man to win a Grand Slam tennis tournament. On September 24th, CBS TV's 60 Minutes debuts. It is now the longest continuously running primetime program in history. September 30th, Boeing rolls out the 747 jumbo jet, the biggest passenger plane the world has seen to date, 231 feet long, wings spanning 196 feet, and seats for 490. October 11th through the 22nd, the Apollo 7 mission, which spends more time in space than all of the Soviet flights to that time combined, makes the first live TV broadcast from up there. October 16th, at the Olympic Games in Mexico City, Americans Tommy Smith and John Carlos received the gold and bronze medals in the 200-meter dash, then raised gloved fists during the national anthem to protest violence toward and poverty among African Americans. The next day, the International Olympic Committee strips their medals and sends them home. It took 30 years after their protest for Smith and Carlos, who went on to become high school athletics coaches, to be honored for their part in furthering the civil rights movement in America. On November the 5th, Nixon wins the presidency, beating Humphrey by just 0.7% of the popular vote. Segregationist candidate George Wallace carries 5 southern states. On November the 5th, Shirley Chisholm of New York becomes the first Black woman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Gaining the nickname Fighting Shirley, Chisholm went on to introduce more than 50 pieces of legislation and championed racial and gender equality, the plight of the poor, and ending the Vietnam War. In 1972, Chisholm campaigned for the Democratic Party presidential nomination, but faced discrimination and was blocked from participating in televised primary debates, and after taking legal action, was permitted to make just one speech. On November 9th, Yale University, after 267 years, decides to admit female undergraduates beginning in 1969. On November the 12th, the Supreme Court unanimously rules that an Arkansas law prohibiting the teaching of evolution in public schools violates the First Amendment. And on December the 1st through the 27th, NASA Apollo 8 becomes the first manned spacecraft to orbit the moon and return safely to Earth.
Thank you very much, Martisa. And that does describe the political and cultural climate of 1968. We thought it would help you to remember some of those things as we now go into the case itself and some of the thought processes that were being had by the lawyers. First, though, we're going to go to the business operation itself and a possible motive for homicide, and to present that to you is retired Court of Appeals Judge Ben Cantrell.
Where'd you get that picture? In the mid-'60s, we've heard that Capital Chevrolet was a thriving business at 5th and Broadway in downtown Nashville. We've heard the story of how the owners were Haynie and his wife Josephine. We've heard the story about how the Gourley children lost their parents when Haynie was 8 and the other children were much younger, how they got parceled out to members of the community up at Cross Plains. And the chief industry there probably was raising dark-fired tobacco. If you ever get curious about what life was like in Cross Plains at the turn of the 19th century, I can recommend 2 books you might read. They both cover the Black Patch Tobacco Wars between the local tobacco farmers and the Duke Tobacco Trust. The first is a historical fiction novel by one of Vanderbilt's fugitives, Robert Penn Warren, and it is called Night Rider. Warren, of course, was from Guthrie, Kentucky, just a few miles up the road from Cross Plains. The other book was written by Dr. Harry Harrison Crow, a professor from the University of Tennessee at Martin. It's called Riders in the Night, and it is an actual historical account of the conflict. We have heard how Haynie came down to Nashville in 1915 when he was 19 years old, and how he joined the army and fought in France with the artillery battery in World War I, and how he learned the automobile business from the people that he worked for. Chiefly at the end of that learning period was the firm that came here from Memphis named Hull Dobbs. Anybody from Memphis, are they still in business? I thought so. The Hull Dobbs franchise was a Ford dealership here. I would say something about the success of Gourley and how he attracted the big people in this city. I won't go through them, but I will say they were pillars of the Vine Street Christian Church. And each year, Haynie donated a new car to the pastor. Perhaps the most important friend Haynie made over the course of his career was a young woman whom he hired as his secretary in 1947. She was already active politically, having served on the state rationing board during the war. Her name was Annabelle Clement from Dixon, Tennessee. When she was hired by Capital Chevrolet, she said she would work for them until her brother was elected governor of Tennessee, which he was in 1952. Through the years, Annabelle became one of the most astute politicians most of us ever knew. She was smart, she was friendly, she could remember everybody's name, the names of their children, where they lived, and who her relatives were. She became known as the First Lady of Tennessee politics. Later in her life, she married Charles O'Brien, who would serve on the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals and later on the Tennessee Supreme Court. My guess is that through the years that Capital Chevrolet sold a lot of Chevrolet cars to the state. By 1969, Haynie was 69 years old, 65, and he needed someone to help with the day-to-day operations of the sprawling business still located at 510 Broadway. He found Bill Powell, 37-year-old graduate of Vanderbilt. Powell had impressive credentials. He had worked in the automobile business since graduating from Vanderbilt, and in 1965, he was the general manager of the Hippodrome franchise also on Broadway. He had built a wide circle of friends in Nashville, and his skillful management of an auto business, paired with his affable personality, made him a perfect choice for the manager of Capital Chevrolet. He joined the company in May of 1965 as general manager. The association must have been close between Gourley and Powell. The record reveals all the witnesses that knew them well referred to the relationship they had as a father-son relationship. Powell himself described the relationship that way. And friends had never seen, they said, two men who had as close of a working relationship as they did. In June of 1966, they modified their agreement to give Powell the right to purchase 25% of the business for $200,000. And in the same transaction, Powell agreed to train Billy Gourley, then a junior at Vanderbilt, to become the eventual owner of the business. Powell borrowed $200,000 from Sam Fleming at Third National Bank and indeed became owner of 25% of the stock in Capital Chevrolet. The contract also named Gourley and Powell as co-owners of the Chevrolet franchise, which is a separate agreement from their agreement inside the corporation. And then, at the death of one of the owners, the other would become the sole owner of the franchise with the right to sell new Chevrolet cars. Billy, the son, was then only 21 and couldn't enter the dealer's son school in Detroit for 3 years. When he graduated from Vanderbilt, he joined the business as a car salesman. By the summer of 1966, Capital Chevrolet needed more room to accommodate its operations that it had outgrown at 5th and Broadway. Gourley and Powell found the perfect spot to build a new building at 600 Murfreesboro Road. They agreed with the property owners as to who would construct the building, and Capital Chevrolet would sign a 20-year lease for $85,000 a year. Gourley, because of his age, did not wish to guarantee a 20-year lease, so Powell and his wife became the sole personal guarantors of the legal obligations. In February of 1968, the company took possession of its new headquarters. The company's property covered a total of 8 acres. The showroom had room for 13 cars. The service department could handle 137 cars at a time. Other areas served the rental car and leasing department, parts department, special section for commercial and light truck sales. In the main building, there were 3 glassed-in executive offices. Haynie and Bill Powell occupied 2 of them. The third one remained vacant, designated for a future executive. New car executives, which Billy was one now, their offices were in glassed-in cubicles on the same floor. The day of the grand opening, on April the 4th, 1968, kicked off a 3-day celebration open house celebration. The first day, Haynie's close friend, Governor Buford Ellington, cut the ribbon and made a short speech describing Haynie as a man old enough to dream and young enough to have a vision for the future. High-ranking executives from the Cheverolet division in Louisville, Cincinnati, and Detroit took part in the celebration. The head of the Chevrolet Motors division in Detroit described the new headquarters as the best in the country. Haynie thanked everyone for making his dream come true and said it was the proudest day as a Chevrolet dealer. But all was not running as smoothly as it may have seemed. Billy felt like Powell didn't respect him. Haynie thought Billy should have been assigned the other executive office in the new building, but Powell had objected. Josephine was concerned about the fact that Billy had not made any progress in the company. And most importantly, Haynie had an eye-opening experience at a meeting of dealers in Memphis on May the 22nd, when two other Tennessee dealers told him that they had sons Billy's age, and these sons had already been made executives and set up to eventually take over the respective businesses. Haynie was most concerned now that Powell would have the exclusive right to the franchise if anything happened to him. On that night of May 22nd, 1968, when they returned from Memphis, the Gourleys got together with Powell to discuss the situation. Powell was not happy with the thought that Billy would become an officer in the company, as the Gourleys seemed to demand. After the tense conversation, Powell said, "Well, maybe the best thing for me to do is get out." Haynie agreed. Powell, however, went home and called Thomas Jackson, the zone manager of the Louisville zone of the Chevrolet company. Powell told him that he had been accused of mistreating Billy. Powell asked Jackson to come down to Nashville to talk with all the parties. Jackson agreed to do so. The next morning, Jackson also received a phone call from the Gourleys asking him to come to Nashville. He arrived that day before lunch. Earlier that day, Haynie had called his friend Sam Fleming at Third National Bank to borrow the $200,000, which he could buy back Powell stock. At the meeting with Jackson, according to Powell, they discussed the procedure to dissolve his and Gourley's partnership. The procedure would require approval by Chevrolet going up the main command from Louisville, Cincinnati, and Detroit. It would take 4 to 6 weeks. The next morning, at about 10:15, Powell asked Gourley to go for a ride with him so that they could talk. They left the dealership around 10:55 or 11. The time was really in play in all of the proof that developed later about how the shot actually happened that killed Gourley. And we will see now how that story changed from time to time, and you will hear more later.
All right. There was a financial motive, as you can plainly see. But motive alone is never enough. There must be an opportunity and a means by which the defendant committed the crime. To present in quite a lot of detail, I will say, the crime scene and that ride that Judge Cantrell just mentioned, we have Frank Grace, retired from the Waller Law Firm, and he's going to walk you through it, and you'll also see it unfold on the screen.
Yeah, my assignment is to talk to you about the scene of the crime, which is really a sequence of events. In the narrowest sense, the scene of the crime, the fatal shooting of Haynie Gourley and the wounding of Bill Powell, was the interior of his 1968 Caprice automobile. But while the caprice provided a lot of information, the question remained, where was it when it became a crime scene? By the time of the trial, the jury was presented the responsibility to decide in which of two locations along Elm Hill Pike in Nashville the shootings occurred, and whether there was in fact one crime, the murder of Haynie Gourley, the wound to Powell being self-inflicted to cover his own guilt. My goal in the next few minutes is to provide you with a visual context of the events of May 28th, or 24th rather, and one key event that happened after the trial started. I'll use some maps and some emoji-like symbols to illustrate the narrative that each side presented to the jury. Let's start with Mr. Powell's account and an overview of the location of the new Capital Chevrolet on Murfreesboro Road and the route of Powell and Gourley on the fateful day of May 24th. Their route took them from the rear of Capital Chevrolet, where they turned right, to Elm Hill Pike, where they turned right and headed east away from town. Powell told officers and later testified that the crime began to unfold at the intersection of Elm Hill Pike and Spence Lane when he slowed down as a truck in front of him turned left onto Spence Lane. The intersection was a dusty construction site, but Powell didn't recall seeing any workmen or any other individuals. As he rolled through the intersection, a black man suddenly appeared in the back seat of the car and demanded money. As Gourley reached for his wallet, the intruder began shooting at Gourley and seemingly at Powell, who was wounded in the left calf. Powell couldn't recall the number of shots, but testified he continued driving until he began to make a U-turn short of Massman Drive. And he says he reached that point and began to make a turn. The gunman managed to open the back door, jump out, close the door, and disappear. Powell returned to Capital Chevrolet at 70 to 80 miles an hour. According to him, the entire episode took 5 to 7 minutes. After the extraction of Powell and Gourley from the automobile, examination of it found that Gourley's glasses, hat, and wallet containing $200 were in the back seat. There was a bullet hole in the back seat of the passenger side front seat that exited through the front. At autopsy, 3 bullets were recovered from or near Gourley's body. 2 were removed from the body and were determined to have been the fatal wounds. A 3rd bullet was found in Gourley's clothing, having caused a bruise in his back. That was the bullet that passed through the seat and evidently hit some kind of metal and was deflected. A 4th bullet passed through Gourley's jaw and through the passenger side window, blowing it out. It was never found. A 5th bullet was found on the floor near a dent at the base of the driver's side door. Turning now to the state's theory, for a variety of reasons, and beginning early on, the investigators began to doubt Powell's explanation of events. With respect to the crime scene, his accounts were inconsistent. At first, he told the employees of Capital Chevrolet that the event happened at a 4-way stop on Elm Hill Pike. The only 4-way stop on Elm Hill Pike was at Fester's Lane, which is the direction opposite of the one that Powell and Gourley took. In fact, the first 2 detectives routed to the crime scene were routed to the Fester's Lane location. While Powell corrected himself by the afternoon when he was interviewed at Vanderbilt, he first told officers that he'd rolled through a stop sign at Spence Lane, and if a policeman had been there, he would have given a ticket. The problem is there was no stop sign at Spence Lane and never had been. He later said that he'd slowed for a truck, and that was true. According to a TBI agent and other investigators, the area where Powell said the gunman got into the car was a dusty roadway construction site with materials that readily stuck to the bottom of shoes of anyone walking in the area. The floor of the back seat of the vehicle did not have any signs of dust or foreign materials, and it was a black upholstery. Unfortunately, the back seat and flooring was not sent to the FBI lab, and there was no testing for dust, hair, fiber, or other materials. According to Powell, as he and Gourley drove along, Gourley commented on all the new construction going on in the area and pointed to the H.D. Lee building as an example. The Lee building is at least a mile past and not visible from where Powell said the shooting took place. It's off the map, too. A few days after the shooting, Powell, along with his lawyer, Cecil Branstetter, and several detectives, drove along Powell's route in an effort to determine where the events described by Powell took place. During this trip, Powell told officers the shooting began 20, 50 feet past the Francis and Lusky building at the corner of Elm Hill Pike and Spence Lane. This was another point of suspicion. The intersection of Maspin Drive, where Powell said he turned around, is 0.6 miles from Spence Lane, where the crime supposedly started. Investigators are also suspicious of the 5 to 7 minute time interval offered by Powell. 2 employees at Capital Chevrolet who had seen Powell and Gourley leave the dealership and then return timed the interval at 15 minutes. Of more tangible significance, a Metro Police officer, Joe Dobson, found pieces of automotive glass on the right-hand side of Elm Hill near Maspin Drive, but at a point beyond where Powell said he began to turn around. An FBI expert confirmed that the material recovered by Dodson was tempered automotive glass from the window of the Powell-Gourley vehicle. According to Dobson, the glass was found under some trees and near some houses. The significance of the trees became apparent with the testimony of Walter Lee Davis. Mr. Davis is working on blasting some ditches for a new Kroger site on the north side of Elm Hill Pike, past Mill Creek. He testified that he was eating lunch. He could see the intersection of Elm Hill and Maspin. He recalled that a black car with 2 white men turned left into Maspin and stopped. The 2 men were talking. After a few minutes, the car backed out, continued a short way further along Elm Hill, away from town, and stopped near some trees. Both men got out, went to the trunk, opened it, and then got back in the car. In a minute, the driver, a large man, got out and went around the car and got in the back seat. Davis said he then heard 4 shots, one being louder than the others, at which point the man in the back seat got back in, got out, closed the trunk, got in, pulled up and turned around and drove back towards town. One of the Capital Chevrolet employees had helped Powell and the dealership, helping, they dragged, half-walked to get him to a place where he could stretch out in the offices. So as they passed the back of the trunk of the car, Powell managed to try and right himself by putting his hands on the trunk and to stand up. The testimony of Charles Donnelly bolstered the state's theory that the shooting took place further along Elm Hill Pike than Powell would have them believe, and that Powell's timeline was far too short. Donnelly was a driver for a time truck company, and on the morning of May 24th, he was waiting at the corner of Arlington Drive and Elm Hill Pike. As he was prepared to turn right, and when he looked left for traffic, he recognized, he saw a black Chevrolet coming towards him and recognized Gourley, with whom he'd done some business, and Powell, maybe from Vanderbilt, but he recognized the 2 of them, he testified. He turned right. The Chevrolet followed him to the intersection of Spence Lane, and he turned left there and saw the Gourley-Powell car proceed on through the intersection. He said a flagman had waved him through here. When he reached the Francis and Lusky site, it's right there at the corner of the intersection there, not far at all. It's an advertising printing business. They do brochures and a variety of things, and he had a load of paper. He said that when he reached Francis and Lusky, he had to turn around, back his truck into their loading dock, get out, go to the back, lift his door, ring for the warehouseman. Warehouseman had to come out, unload the truck, and then go get a receipt. While Mr. Donnelly was standing there, he saw the Gourley car come back through the intersection, slowly because of the construction. There were manhole covers exposed, raised. So the car came through the intersection slowly. He saw Mr. Gourley, the passenger, slumped over. New and dramatic, potentially case-altering evidence was discovered by the state during the trial, but after it had closed its proof. In September of '68, Henry Lewis, another construction worker, was walking along the north side of Elm Hill Pike, across from Mount Zeno School, which is west of Spence Lane, and between the intersection of Spence and Capitol Chevrolet. As Lewis walked along looking for scrap or things he could pick up and sell, he found a .38 caliber revolver with the muzzle sticking in the ground. The cylinder held 5 empty casings, which Lewis threw away in a dirt pile near a construction site. They were never recovered. The 5 empty casings are significant, as the murmur from the crowd indicates. From the medical examiner's report, we know that there were 4 shots fired at Gourley and a 5th had struck Powell. Mr. Davis only heard 4 shots. The barrel of the gun was corroded and degraded to such an extent that a valid ballistics comparison could not be obtained. Lewis took the gun home, but left it at his brother's house ultimately, and its existence was not discovered by the state until Powell was almost literally on the stand testifying. The morning of July 28th, Powell was testifying. The gun was found the night before. The DA was alerted that morning. The gun was ultimately traced to Bob Frensley, who had worked at Capitol and said he'd given to Powell the gun sometime prior to Gourley's death. We have a couple Google Map shots to show you the route there. Is that yellow line is Elm Hill Pike, 1.9 miles from where Gourley and Haynie entered Elm Hill Pike to Massman Drive. Of course, he came back. You see the stars, that's Mount Zeno School, the first one. The second is Spence Lane, and the third is Massman Drive. Now it's time to meet the lawyers who would try this case and hope to persuade the jury of their respective views of what happened on May 24th, 1968.
You know, preparing this program was probably a little bit like preparing the case for trial, because the facts that we're putting in front of you are the same facts that these great lawyers had to deal with during the trial, except that, as Frank just pointed out, some of this evidence came in during the trial, and that may have played a role in the jury deliberations. We'll talk about that in a moment. But first, I want to tell you a little more about Jack Norman. As I said, he was born in 1904. He lived to be 90 years old and was arguably the best trial lawyer in Nashville in the second half of the 20th century. The title for the first half of that century would probably go to Seth Walker, and both Norman and Hooker would probably agree to that, because Mr. Norman named one of his sons Seth Walker Norman, and you know him to be now retired criminal court judge who is widely acclaimed for the origination of the Davidson County Drug Court. I originally had planned to say that Norman graduated from Vanderbilt Law School in 1925, but Mr. Hardin corrected me at one of our meetings and pointed out that because Mr. Norman was able to get his law license before graduation, he left and never graduated. We think he would have been the Founders Medalist that year, the first in his class, but because he was so eager to get downtown and begin his practice, he apparently didn't participate in that particular ceremony. His first case, we're told, for trial was a murder case wherein he represented a cook who was charged with homicide, and he won that case, and for his fee, he received a Stutz Bearcat automobile. I don't know if that's in any way prophetic of this particular case or not, but he certainly had a way with juries in Davidson County. Mr. Norman was a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers and a president of the Nashville Bar Association. He was well known already from the 1950s for having been asked by Governor Clement to prosecute Ralston Schofield, a criminal court judge in Chattanooga, for supposedly taking a bribe, and that's covered more thoroughly in our Hoffa presentation from a few years ago. I want you to listen now to the description that Mr. Norman gave of the way he used the principle of playing the underdog in his trials.
Well, I did as I have always done when the chance presented itself in a case like that. I took the role of an underdog from the beginning. I had rather defend cases from the role of an underdog than otherwise. I think I've always thought it was an advantage to you. So I didn't miss any opportunity to create that stance. And it just fed the ego of the other side and the news reporters who were close to and favoring the other side. They began to pour it on thick, as we used to say then. Well, the case came on to trial, and I will have to say that I got some awfully lucky breaks in the case. In order to lay the basis for the prosecution and to show how the envy of Powell toward Gourley had originated, they had to bring in some businessmen to prove the business relation and set up out there. And to do that, they had to use some very prominent witnesses, people like John Sloan of Kane, Sloan and Company, Sam Fleming, president of the Third National Bank, and some others. Well, I had talked to those men, and of course, they were honest men. And when the state, they knew nothing about the facts of this case. They were only used to set up their business relation so that the state could then proceed to show how the differences had started between them and why, as they claim, Powell would want to kill Gourley or get him out of the way or got so mad at him that he killed him. Well, I was able to get from not only these two very known and widely respected businessmen, on cross-examinations, I had them to give Powell a splendid reputation for truth and veracity, and I drew it long out of him. Well, in the trial of a criminal case, whenever you can draw something beneficial to a defendant out of state witnesses, it is much stronger in your favor than it is when you have some testimony of the defendant's witnesses for things in the defendant's favor.
That's the voice of a master, I think we'll all agree. You'll learn more about him as the program continues, but now I think we just want to quickly observe that in these programs, when we're talking about these great lawyers of the century past, sometimes it's important to point out that even though they were frequently great adversaries of one another, they were also great friends. And the picture that I think we have of Mr. Norman and Mr. Hooker walking in the hall, you may see in a moment. But I want you to listen to what Hal Hardin had to say about the friendship between these men and a little more about Mr. Norman himself.
Jack Norman Sr. And Mr. Hooker, they had a lot of things in common, but I mean, just trying to talk about Mr. Norman by himself, he was charismatic, he was intelligent, he had a curious mind. For example, when he lived out on West End Avenue, he decided he was going to count how many cars came by at 8:30 in the morning rush hour and what color they were. Just, you know, he was just interested in everything that went on. He had a wide interest in the world. He represented some of the most powerful people in the country. I mean, how many people could have Jack and Jacqueline Kennedy over to a place in the alley. He lived in the alley at 213 3rd Avenue North, and he would have them over for breakfast. He was a guy that could call the Attorney General of the United States directly, and he was talking to the Attorney General. He called the president the day before he died. The president was killed in Dallas, and the president said he was going to send somebody here to talk to Jack, Kitty O'Brien, I think, and of course that never happened. But he was that kind of guy. They also represented the downtrodden. We had cases that we tried pro bono. Just because somebody didn't have enough money. Well, he did a lot of that, and he really wanted you to give attention to it, just like you would if you were representing the governor or whomever. And incidentally, he did represent several governors. I remember one time he came in to me and he said, "There's this 18-year-old boy out here, and there's 40 people at the Kentucky Fried Chicken that say he came out there with a gun and robbed them. I know his family. I think he's not guilty. You want to help me try the case?" And it was just, it took a long, long time. I don't know how many countless hours until we tried the case and got a good verdict too.
John Hooker Sr. was born on September 9, 1903, and passed away on Christmas Eve, 1970, after hosting his firm's annual Christmas party at his office on Union Street in Nashville. He was also a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers and had been both president of the Nashville Bar Association and the Tennessee Bar Association, putting him in the same league with Mr. Landquist, seated down here on the second row. But you've got a ways to go, I think. You agree with that? On one occasion, I was told this, and I was trying to confirm it with Gareth Aiden, who's here, but Gareth did not recall it. But I distinctly remember one of Mr. Hooker's partners telling me about a time that he had gone to Washington, D.C. to argue a case in the U.S. Supreme Court, something he did a number of times. And he didn't like to fly, so he would frequently ride the train. Of course, his law firm represented the trains, the railroad, so that was not unusual for him. But he would read the briefs on the train before he got to the court, so he'd be ready to make the argument. And on this particular occasion, it said that his argument was so persuasive and so entertaining that Justice William O. Douglas invited him back into chambers, and that's when these two men became very close friends. And I believe I'm correct, because I did see the obituary that Justice Douglas was one of the honorary pallbearers at Mr. Hooker's funeral. His law partner, Seth Walker, whom you've already mentioned, was also quite notable in that he had represented Lem Motlow, the owner of the Jack Daniel Distillery, in a murder case just outside of St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis keeps coming up. And as a result of the not guilty verdict that Mr. Walker got for Mr. Motlow in that case, the law firm of Walker and Hooker received a 1/3 share in the Jack Daniel's Distillery. This was not something that went unnoticed by other lawyers and judges throughout the state of Tennessee, because after that, and after the unfortunate and untimely death of Mr. Walker, Mr. Hooker retained 1/6 of that and would frequently donate boxes, crates of Jack Daniel's whiskey to people across the state. Listen to his son, John J., tell about that and the impact that it had on his life.
Yeah, Thomas Shriver was something else. He was a good man. That was one of the advantages of being my father's son, is that I got access to people and opportunities that I wouldn't ordinarily have had. For example, I've always had a great warm friendship with Howard Baker, even though I'm a Democrat and he's a Republican. But it really emanated from my father's relationship with Howard's daddy. And my father, I think I told you privately, had the wonderful circumstance that he owned a 1/6 interest in the Jack Daniel's Distillery, and his law partner owned a 6, so they owned 1/3 of the Jack Daniel's Distillery all during the war, the years thereafter. And they'd love to give it around to these public figures and judges and lawyers and whatever. And Howard Baker's father used to get this Jack Daniels from my father, and so there was a great friendship based on that, and then Howard and I got to be friends based on that.
It's called marketing today, is that right? Yeah, it might be called something else today too. I don't know about that part, but Mr. Hooker did represent, as Hal has already said, the powerful and the underprivileged, as well as Mr. Hooker representing the state of Tennessee on occasion as special prosecutor, as he did in this case. All right, very quickly, I can't tell whether 2 means Shriver or 2 is the whole thing, but I'll just keep going. You know, the good thing about being up here and Ed holding the signs is, what can he do? I mean, he can't come up here and just carry me away. The third lawyer we're going to talk about was much younger than these other 2. His name was Thomas Humphrey Shriver, and he was known as Tom to most of his friends, and sometimes Tommy to his really old friends. But he was the district attorney, having been elected to that position in 1966. So he'd been in office barely 2 years, less than 2 years when the crime occurred, and then it was in his 3rd year when the trial took place. And I'll tell you a little bit about him. He was born on December 27, 1931, and died unexpectedly of a heart attack in his office in the courthouse on October 24, 1997. But he went to Stokes Elementary School, just like I did, and Hillsborough High School, just like I did, Vanderbilt University, and then Vanderbilt Law School after the Air Force. And he graduated out at the law school in the class of 1957, along with Jim Neal, Tom Higgins, John Hollins, George Barrett, John J. Hooker, what they call the great class of 57. But soon after becoming a lawyer, he became very political. And he ran for and won a seat in the Tennessee House of Representatives. Then 2 years later, a seat in the Senate of the legislature of Tennessee. Then 2 years after that, his friend Jim Neal, friend and classmate Jim Neal, made sure he was appointed Assistant United States Attorney by Robert F. Kennedy, and he served there until 1966 when he decided to run for district attorney, and he won that election, as we know, and was reelected in 1974 and in 1982. Upon the untimely death of Judge Sterling P. Gray, a gentleman that Tom Shriver had mentored, both hired as an investigator. I believe the photograph is from his hiring as an investigator in '66, and then later as a lawyer, educated at the Nashville School of Law, and then ultimately as a criminal court judge. Tom Shriver succeeded him upon his death, and that's a bit of irony that I don't guess we see in any other place. But by all accounts, Shriver was honest as the day is long, and he had a great reputation for being an honest politician and a good district attorney, although I think we would have to admit probably not a great reputation as a trial lawyer himself. But Torrey's here, and I think Torrey would agree that he hired some great lawyers, so that tended to make up for it. Okay, so he was a great advocate for victims and also was very careful to protect the rights of defendants as well. And in order to finish out the part on Shriver, we made a command decision to use a piece of the oral history that Hal Hardin and I did a few years ago to tell about Tom, our friend Tom, since he was not available for the oral history that the bar now does. And I will say, I was a student and had come to the DA's office in the fall of '68, just a couple of months after Mr. Gourley was shot. And Hal Hardin and I became friends. Now, we don't like to talk about how old we are, but I'll just say that I'm pushing 80 and he's pushing back from the other side. Is that fair enough? Okay, let's look at what Hal and I had to say about our great friend and boss, Tom Shriver. Tom Shriver was a man of his word. If he said something to you, you could put it in the bank.
Tom was very smart. He was a smart guy. He was a super honest guy. He painted with a broad brush. He he gave us a tremendous amount of authority and freedom to do what we wanted to do. We did have a rule, though, that if we had something really, really sticky, I mean, the first rule is don't tell Shriver, because he'll get you into some philosophical discussion, and you never will be able to resolve it as fast as you wanted to. But I would describe his management style as being very honest. He worked long hours. He was there late every night. He backed us up, and really was a joy to work for.
Yes, and I think universally regarded as one of the most ethical men that any of us had ever met. And I remember thinking to myself, you know, he still appreciates the work that we do and the adventure that we have on a daily basis to be in court and do all these things. And he really wants to know. He has an intellectual curiosity about how did that happen and what did it take and all this sort of thing. And he was one of us. He was somebody, even though he was the boss, and we used to call him the High General, but he was also one of us. He was young enough that he could identify with what we were doing. I think the thing that I would want to say in closing is that Tom Shriver was a unique individual who obviously inspired us and many others. The young lawyers that came out of that office and went on to have life careers in the law is very long. We've only mentioned a few here today. But he was an inspirational person. And I think we all looked up to him, not only because he was the boss, but because he really cared about people. He wanted the right outcome in every case. And if he was wrong, he would admit it. But if he was right and believed he was right, he would fight to the last inch. And that's a great example to have when you're a young lawyer coming out of law school and see somebody like that and try to model yourself after. The next lawyer that we want to cover is Cecil Branstetter, who, if you read the transcript, you'll find out that Cecil did a lot of the questioning from the defense side. Mr. Norman was clearly a part of it and took several crucial witnesses, but I think Frank Grace would agree with me when he outlined the transcript for us that Mr. Branstetter was really taking command for the defense in many cases, and we are privileged to have today Dewey Branstetter, Cecil's son, to tell us a little more about his dad.
Thanks, Ed. I appreciate it, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about my dad. And when I look out and see several folks who knew Cecil back in the day, it gives me a warm feeling because you are getting fewer and farther between. And I have to confess that during the run-through of this program on Monday, I was a little bit gobsmacked because I got a little emotional talking about my father. He was my hero. So if I get a little emotional today, I hope you'll bear with me and give me a little slack. In addition to being Bill Powell's lawyer, some of the older lawyers here know that during his 60-plus years of practice, Cecil was involved in many high-profile cases. He was one of the few white lawyers who represented black students who were arrested for trying to integrate Nashville's lunch counters in the early 1960s. He represented the Highlander Folk School, where Martin Luther King taught students in nonviolent protest when the state tried to shut it down and take its charter. He represented Jimmy Hoffa in the early 1960s until he learned that Hoffa and his co-defendants were engaged in jury tampering. Some of you may remember the program that the Historical Committee did a number of years ago on Hoffa, and that was talked about in some detail. And I'm going to digress just for a second, because when Cecil learned that Hoffa was trying to fix the jury, he wasn't going to be a part of that. he immediately asked the federal judge who was overseeing the case to be relieved as counsel for Hoffa. And this was before the Florida Professional Responsibility Rules, so Cecil couldn't disclose to the judge why he wanted to withdraw. And the judge was reluctant to let him out because he thought it was a tactic to delay the trial that was coming up. But ultimately, the court did grant the motion to withdraw, and Dad was relieved from representing Hoffa. Sadly, the lawyer who took his place as Hoffa's Tennessee trial counsel, Tommy Osborne, became involved in the efforts to tamper with the jury. He was convicted of jury tampering, lost his law license, and was sentenced to several years in the federal penitentiary. He died by suicide not long after he was released from prison. Cecil also represented judges and lawyers, including Eddie Sisk, Governor Blanton's legal counsel, in the cash for clemency scandal in the late 70s. And although well known for the criminal cases that he handled, Cecil primarily practiced civil law. Criminal law was probably less than 10% of his practice throughout his career. And the Powell trial was the only first-degree murder case he ever tried. He was comfortable representing a criminal defendant, a plaintiff in an injury case, a labor union before the National Labor Relations Board, a utility district before the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, or parties in a business dispute. Like Mr. Hooker and Mr. Norman, he practiced at a time when an attorney could be a true general practitioner and practice in a variety of fields, doing them all very well. In addition to his legal career, Cecil was very active in the community. He served a term in the legislature, Tennessee legislature, in the early 1950s, where he sponsored and successfully passed the law that allowed women to serve on juries. Prior to that time, women were not allowed to serve on juries. There were 2 women on Bill Powell's jury, and they might not have been there except for the efforts of Cecil Branstetter. He was also a member of the Charter Commission that wrote the Metro Charter that was adopted in 1962, which consolidated Nashville and Davidson County into the metropolitan form of government that has made Metro Nashville the thriving city it is today. He then served as chairman of the Charter Revision Commission for over 30 years and is frequently referred to as the father of the metropolitan government. He served 2 terms as chairman of the Board of Professional Responsibility, and he served on many other boards and commissions throughout his lifetime. What most lawyers don't know about Cecil Branstetter is his humble beginnings. Born in 1920, he was one of 14 children born in Deer Lodge, Tennessee, a little bitty community on the Cumberland Plateau in Morgan County. Growing up in the Depression without medical care, several of his siblings didn't survive to adulthood. And other than one older sister who went to college late in life, he was the only one of his siblings to go to college, let alone law school. He worked his way through college milking cows in the dairy at Lincoln Memorial University. And after serving in the Army in Europe, he was fortunate to be able to attend Vanderbilt University Law School on the GI Bill. Quite a career for someone who didn't have any advantages as a child. As the old saying goes, it's easy to think you hit a home run when you were born on third base. Cecil Branstetter hit a home run. He wasn't born anywhere near the ballpark. He never forgot where he came from and was often the champion of the underdog. But in Nashville, Cecil may be best known for the Powell trial. And man, as you're going to learn today, what a trial it was. Along with Jack Norman Sr., Cecil was successful in securing the acquittal of Bill Powell on the charge of first-degree murder of his business partner, Haynie Gourley. The Powell trial in 1969 was the most sensational trial Nashville had seen up until that time. And even in the 53 years since then, no murder trial has captivated the imagination of the community the way the Powell trial did.
Well, Bill Powell, whom I did not know at the beginning at all. I knew Dick Satterfield, who was head of was executive director of the Tennessee Automotive Association. But Bill Powell was accused of killing his partner, Gourley, in the Capitol Chevrolet. The officers were out on Murfreesboro Road over a dispute as to who would be the dealer or who would be the partner in Capital Chevrolet. But I got a call from Dick Satterfield saying that Powell was out in the hospital, that he had been shot, and wanted to know if I would go talk to him. And of course, I'd had criminal law practice only in the labor field, mostly up to that point. And I said, well, I go talk to him, but I don't know that I don't like murder cases. I'd never had at that point a murder case as such, possible first-degree murder case, because I did not want to be in it. So I went out and saw him, and he'd been shot in the leg. And later on, the claim was made that he shot himself in the leg, and he also shot his partner, Gourley, and killed him. When the case came to trial, every word that was said in the courtroom was run in the newspaper. They had court reporters who would come in and spend 15 minutes each. They'd go out and transcribe their notes. Newspapers were paying for it, and there was no prohibition against doing it that way. They would go out and send another one in, transcribe it, and have it. So it was all run in the newspaper. And by the way, Dewan and Jane, my two lawyer children, blew up those, and I have a copy of all those newspapers.
Well, you had a special prosecutor in that
Yeah,
case.
John Hooker Sr. was special prosecutor.
And Tommy Shriver was the district attorney?
Right.
And a young Hal Harden was an assistant district attorney?
He was assistant district attorney. Right. So they were...
And who was helping you in the case?
Well, at the end, Jack Norman, I felt that, and John Toon wanted to get Jack in for advice, and that was a good idea. Certainly was all for it.
But the two of you waived closing argument in a murder case. And many people thought that the reason for that was because of the extensive oratorical abilities of John Hooker Sr. in making a closing argument to a jury in a criminal case. Do you have any comment about that?
Oh, well, we talked at length, of course. But Powell made that decision, had to ultimately, as to whether or not we would argue. Of course, that we knew that we could foreclose Hooker's argument, and he was a great lawyer, and he would have waved that bloody shirt all over that, back and forth, up and down, walked back and forth. And I later learned from his wife that he had spent 10 hours before a mirror practicing what he was going to say. That's to his credit. I don't mean that, but it was amusing. She told me that, said he spent at least 10 hours in front of a mirror practicing his closing argument. Well, he didn't get to make it.
Cecil continued to practice for 40 years after the Powell trial, actively practicing well into his 80s. He passed away in 2014 at the age of 93.
All right. We know we're over. We started about 10 minutes late, by the way, but we'll catch up in the second half. But we do want to go ahead and show you these videos. We talked about how to put Hal Harden in front of you. Star of stage, screen, downtown library, television. And I won't give you more introduction because I don't guess he needs it or deserves it, right? So we'll, Hal Harden and a few clips just giving you the inside story on the third man at the counsel table.
Mr. Hooker, every time he'd see him, he'd get on there, Ed, how you doing? So good to see you. You know, I mean, he was that way. I mean, it was a waitress or whomever, and Mr. Norman was the same way. They really paid attention, but they were awesome in their cross-examination of witnesses, and they both had great speech-making ability, incredible. I know judges wouldn't permit a lot of things they did, and I can tell you several examples that I'm sure no judge would allow. I think that even the judges would get caught up in the rhythm of what they were doing and the drama of the moment, and they would sort of get sucked in too, like everybody else, and nodding their heads but the rules of procedure and evidence were not as strict as they are now. I mean, we never, as a prosecutor, you never knew who's going to be an expert witness. You didn't have to disclose who's going to be your expert. A lot of these trials were trials by ambush, on both sides, and that was fun in a lot of ways. But as we would never tolerate that now. But they developed an acute ability, like an animal hunting in the woods. I mean, they learned how to hunt in these woods, and they were good at it. I'd read a book then, I haven't seen it since, called The Last Hurrah. It's talking about how things change in society. Like I think the election of 1966 was the last hurrah, the way you campaigned and so forth. And I thought, this is the last of the great old trials, and I want to be a part of it, regardless of how much I'm getting paid. First trial. First trial. And I told somebody, I said, I've already tried the trial of the century or participated in it, and I don't need to do anything else. But the next week, though, it was really funny to me. The next week after I had gone through this trial and listening, for Mr. Norman and Mr. Hooker for all this period of time, and the next week I had general session, after the trial, I had general sessions court where I was prosecuting. And I went down there, and I found myself saying things like, well, we're ready for trial. Doing my best, subconsciously, of trying to talk like them. And it didn't work. I thought we had several problems in the prosecution and several strong points. I was concerned. I loved Mr. Hooker being in it because I thought he added so much to it, and he added such depth and such great trial ability and so forth. But I just sensed from the very beginning that it looked strange that here you had the lawyer for the Gourley family being a prosecutor. You did not have. You've been a prosecutor. It's nice to stand up and say, I represent the state of Tennessee. I represent the United States of America. Juries understand that. I think that I was worried that the jury would get the impression that this is a business deal and this is a civil case and we got no business being in it. That was one of my main concerns. And I never voiced it. I mean, I felt it though. But on the other hand, he brought a lot to the table. There's no question. The fact that we found so much evidence after the trial started. This case started off as a very circumstantial case, and most people who watch Perry Mason think that, well, a circumstantial case is a very weak case. Truth be told, circumstantial case is very strong. It's like putting all the pieces together, and it just appeals to you logically. And I thought that's kind of the case we had, and in looking back, I mean, a couple of our first witnesses were, I think, Sam Fleming, who was the president of Third National Bank here, a great man, a great icon in town, and I forget who else was the first couple of witnesses, but immediately Mr. Norman or Cecil started asking them after they got through, and all we put them on for was the business section of it. This is what the business was, and here were the contracts, and ergo the motive for Mr. Powell to commit the crime, that sort of thing. And so in cross-examination, Mr. Norman said, well, now you know Bill Powell, don't you? Well, yeah. And you know that he was, I can't remember all the crime. He was a Vanderbilt player and was All-American and went on and on and on. And I made him ask him, and you know his reputation for truth and veracity. Yeah, and it's good. Yeah, so I thought that hurt us at the very beginning. And then in the defendant's case, I remember he put on, I believe, Judge Swigert and Judge Benson Trimble, two of our circuit judges over here, and who gave their opinion that they knew the opinion for truth and veracity of Bill Powell, and it was good. And also, the law, and I have not checked this in a while, but the law at that time was, well, if the other side brings that up, then you can ask, well, have you heard about his reputation when he was out at Vanderbilt? Have you heard the reputation that he was a bully? Which we'd heard. I mean, we had a good faith. As long as you had a good faith basis, you could ask about bad things, and we didn't do that. We didn't do that, and then of course we didn't get to hear Mr. Hooker give his final argument, and I'm going to tell you, I did get to hear it several times, both before and after the trial, and I'm telling you, he was great. There was this guy that testified for the defense, and I believe his name was Mr. Wilson, and he testified late in the afternoon, as I recall, that he had examined Mr. Powell's coat, and he had come to the conclusion that there was gunpowder on the coat in a peculiar sort of way that indicated, it corroborated Powell's story. And he said he had this sophisticated equipment or whatever, and he was able to determine this. And we thought it was just totally bogus. It was just like junk science or whatever. But the day was getting late. It was like 4:30 or so, and we all huddled and said, we need a recess. We need a recess real bad. And so we asked the court, Judge, we're going to have a long cross-examination, and it's getting late. We would like an adjournment until in the morning. And Cornelius was happy, Judge Cornelius was happy to grant it. So we went to Hooker Hill Farms. Mr. Hooker had a 350-acre farm out here on Clovercroft Drive, mansion, beautiful, beautiful place. Anyway, we went out there, and we were licking our wounds. We had, I think the TBI chief was out there, the chief of police. Everybody that was powerful in law enforcement was there at Mr. Hooker's house, talking about what we're going to do. And Mr. Hooker started serving whiskey, and we all were kind of down when we got there. And as the night grew a little older, everybody got to thinking, well, maybe we can do something. And we also, well, let's get the FBI involved. Let's get the FBI. Well, how do we get the FBI? Well, Mr. Hooker could call J. Edgar Hoover, the director. And so we got the FBI on the line. We ran down an agent, as I recall, he was in Iowa. And they thought this was junk science. And it got the ball rolling. But, you know, we still had a long way to go. We had good cross-examination stuff, but we didn't have any expert or anything like that. So they all left. Everybody left. And as was the custom, it was just me and Mr. Hooker left alone. You know, and I was single, and I followed Mr. Hooker around like a puppy because I thought he was just such an awesome, awesome man. And we were sitting at his kitchen table, and he lulled in the conversation, and he looked at me and he said, well, Hal, I want you to go to Wisconsin. This man was from Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin. I said, okay. I looked at my wife and said, what do you want me to do if I go to Madison, Wisconsin? Well, and the first thing I said, Mr. Hooker, it's almost midnight. How am I going to get to Madison, Wisconsin? And you want me to come back in the morning, I guess? And he said, I want you to find us a witness. Okay, I'm thinking, all right, I'm just out of law school, and I'm going to go to Madison, Wisconsin, and get you a witness in the middle of the night. And I almost passed it off. I thought maybe it's drinking too much or something. And I got up and excused myself. I went to the restroom there, washed my hands, and get ready to go home. And I came back and I said, and how am I going to get to Madison, Wisconsin? And it was like, he looked at me like, well, I never thought about that. And he said, I'll tell you what. And he picked up the phone, kitchen phone was on the side. He made a few phone calls and he said, there's a jet airplane out at Bearfield warming up on the runway. You take it. Find a witness. So Mrs. Hooker did not like to fly, and she knew I wasn't crazy about flying, especially a small plane in bumpy weather. And and I'm walking out the door, she put a bottle of scotch in my coat and said, here, this will make the bumps a little easier. And I went out there, and there was a jet airplane on the runway warming up, and I got on it, having no idea what the world I'm going to do. And I got into Madison, Wisconsin early in the morning, and I said, well, the only thing I know to do is to go to the sheriff's office. And I walked into the sheriff's office, I don't know, 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, and I'm thinking, now they're going to think I'm some homeless guy. I haven't shaved in a day, and I probably reek of scotch Mr. Hooker had doused me with. And I said, I'll probably be kicked out of here. And they said, what do you want? And I said, well, I'd like to talk to the sheriff. I said, I'm an assistant DA in Nashville, and I flew up here on a jet airplane, and I need to talk to the sheriff bad about somebody that's a witness from Madison. Well, lo and behold, they let me see the sheriff around 6. And I went in there to see him, and I told him about this guy Wilson. He's a fraud. He said, that's just junk science. He said, we don't trust him, and goes on to really talk about him and so forth. And then he said, and then I said, well, Sheriff, we really need you, and justice needs you to come back to Nashville and testify in this trial. And I never forget, he leaned forward and said, well, just how are we going to get to Nashville, Tennessee? And I leaned back, just like Mr. Hooker did. I said, I have a jet airplane warming up. My best imitation. Raced out to the airport with him and his deputies, I recall. And the plane's battery was down. It wouldn't even start. But anyway, we got here a little after 9, and I brought them to the courthouse and delivered them. And I said, here's what we got. And I remember Charlie Hunter, the chief investigator, said, Hal, you need to go shave and maybe take a shower. So anyway, that was how I made a trip to Wisconsin. But it shows something about Mr. Hooker and Mr. Norman and that era. That they would say things like that, and they believed it. Just make it happen. I mean, don't say we can't do anything. We'll just go to Madison, Wisconsin in the middle of the night, and we'll find a witness. That's what we do.
All right. Was that good? Now, here's the, before you get up, I know we're a little over. We're going to shorten it to 10 minutes, and we have a way of shortening some of the programs in the second half so we get you out on time. But there's a lot more of that. We may just sell that. I don't know. We'll check on that. Federal court may not let us do that. Take a 10-minute break. Be back in your seats because it just gets better.